Hey everybody, Jared Yates, Sexton here. I just wanted to let everybody know that the paperback edition of American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World But Failed Its People, is coming out this September 14th. It's available for pre-order right now. If you haven't had a chance to read this book, it is my reconsideration of American history. This is exactly what the people who are hysterical and losing their minds about critical race theory and accurate history, this is what the actual history of America looks like, where we came from, how we ended up at this point, and unfortunately where we're going if we don't learn from that history. This new edition also includes a new chapter that goes beyond the end of American Rule, the original edition, and this new chapter features a reckoning with the events of January 6th, with the attempted coup of the election, Trump and all of his cronies trying to overthrow the presidential election, and of course the ongoing tragedy of the pandemic. If you haven't had a chance to pick up American Rule, this is your chance. It also would make a great gift for your friends and family, for people who either know what's going on or who could use a little bit of insight into what is happening right now. I've heard from a lot of people that it's made a difference, so if you will, check that out. It's American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World But Failed Its People, the paperback, which comes out September 14th. Thank you for your support. Hey everybody, welcome to the Muckrake Podcast. I'm Jared Yates Sexton here, as always, with Nick Hauselman. We got a jam-packed show today. Later on, I'm going to introduce Joseph L. Flatley, the host of Failed State Update, as well as the author of the new book, New Age Grifter, the true story of Gabriel of Urantia and his cosmic family. It's a really good book. We're going to get into all these strange cults and this new need for meaning in these strange times. And maybe one of the reasons that we're looking for new meaning and people are desperate for it is because, Nick, we've got open shootouts in American cities right now. One of the more disturbing scenes I've seen in forever. We're taping this on Monday, August 23rd, the day after Proud Boys and far-right extremists, paramilitary street gangs, basically went into Portland. The police stood down, the law enforcement stood down, and I think we got a glimpse of a possible ugly future.
Right, it's the purge. We got a little sense of the purge in real life, especially because, the police literally were like, we are not going to get in between these two groups. We expect you guys to keep yourself apart from each other. But you're aware that, the Proud Boys descend upon Portland every year to do this, right? Their main objective is to invite or to lure the Antifa people in Portland or whatever to counter a protest. It's like a very strange performative thing where they are looking for a fight.
Yeah, so Portland has become kind of ground zero for a lot of this stuff. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Chief among them is that there's a really strong leftist presence in Portland. Mm-hmm. And of course, during the BLM protest, we saw them bring about this autonomous zone and sort of bring, their own sort of ideology into practice. But they've also been incredibly active in saying, we are not going to put up with fascists in this town. And so we have seen one fight after another. And there's a lot of things that we have to talk about to break down what this is, why it's happening, and where it's going. But chief among them right now is the fact that we have a bunch of wannabe LARPing, live-action, role-playing fascists who want to go out, they want to have fights, they want to brutalize people, and they also thrive off of the media coverage, which makes it hard to talk about because we have to deal with this thing, but we also have to be aware of the fact that these people are looking to increase their profile and also their reach and their ability to recruit people into their movement and gain power. So this is a very, very strange, very modern problem, although the roots of it aren't modern at all. And we'll get more into that as we go along.
I had to look up LARP, by the way. But now I get it.
So for people who don't know, LARPing, live action role playing, it's I don't know if you've ever seen this. Back in the day when, when I was in graduate school, and then right after I got out of graduate school, every now and then you would drive by a park or an open spot, and you'd see people wearing like almost pool noodles. Do you know what I'm talking about? With
Oh
like
no.
swords and stuff. Yeah, and they would have like medieval battles. There, of course, are Renaissance fairs, all that stuff. But weirdly enough, in this current age, we have a lot of people, particularly because of the internet and because of a lot of these needs to be a part of something quote unquote larger than themselves. We have people who live action role play themselves into being violent paramilitary street gangs.
Where else do we see this happen? Where a group will incite violence and film it and put it up there as a recruiting tool. Does that sound familiar at all to you, Jared? Because I think the answer, right, is all these horrible things we'll see from like the Taliban or from Al Qaeda. You know, the extreme Muslim terrorist organizations will do the same exact thing as what the Proud Boys are doing too. They're each taking a page from each other, and it's I suppose with the Portland police, because this happens every freaking year for them, like I guess they got to the wit's end, right? They're like, we're going to stop dealing with this, and maybe it's not working great when we do interact and whatever. Maybe we'll try the other way and get out of the way and let them hash it out or something.
Well, I think it gets a little bit more disturbing than that. I think when you're really put underneath the microscope, and I'm glad that you compared them to groups like the Taliban, because that's exactly right. One of the things that happens, and we talk a lot about society and how society can start to fray, and start to sort of break down a little bit. Like I think a lot about this. Like I was driving to the library today. I discovered this weird far right, early 20th century proto-fascistic group in France. That was like really, really frightening and weird. And I wish people would have talked about this, and it made a lot of sense out of things. But I was like driving to the library to go. And meanwhile, in my town, there was a line into a Dunkin' Donuts that was like a mile and a half long onto the main street. You know what I mean? And I was just thinking about this proto-fascistic group that I know this is going to sound weird, Nick, but while France was having political troubles right before World War I, all of these proto-fascists who wanted to overthrow the government, they had a lot of young guys who got really razzed up on this idea, and then they would go out in the streets and beat the shit out of people. I know that's strange. That doesn't sound anything like the Proud Boys, right? And I was driving, and I was just looking at these people waiting to go into Dunkin' Donuts, and I was thinking about how much we depend on our idea of status quo, right? Tomorrow's going to feel like today. And meanwhile, we're watching this stuff happen, and people are starting to, like, some people will pay attention to it. But last night we had like a violent street battle pushed by far right extremists in a major American city. And not many people paid that much attention to it. You know what I mean? They just kind of pretended it didn't happen. And so what you actually realize is that these things, they warn you that society is not stable, that society is starting to fray, that order, that status quo that so many of us depend on is starting to evaporate. And that's when you start to have these things. That's when people go into legislatures with guns. That's when people try and overthrow elections violently. That's when you have these violent street gangs, is when all of a sudden that status quo that we all depend on and hope for is starting to disappear.
Or that becomes the status quo. Right?
Or it becomes the status quo.
We are so used to seeing this. Like they have live footage of a guy behind like a newspaper box, whatever he's doing, firing at people indiscriminately, people returning fire or somebody returning fire. That didn't go that viral on Twitter when I had seen it come across my feed. They ultimately did arrest that guy. I mean, it's funny because it's the white shooters who survive these things. They never get shot or anything. They're on the ground and they arrest them and they don't beat them up or anything. But that was what was happening here. I suppose we're lucky in this very specific instance that like they're just not good shots. Like they don't know how to shoot their guns, because I don't understand how, like, 'cause you see the bullets erupting around them. Like they're like 5-6 feet off. Like I don't know and he's not that covered. He should have gotten shot, as far as I could tell, based on where he was standing. So either we're lucky that was the case, or they're just who knows what. But it sounds insane. And people were literally walking around the corner, like peering out and going, "Oh, what's going on?" And then like taking off and running the other way out around the corner. It was that open.
But that is okay. So the fact that is happening, right? That there is this open firing out on a street, that establishes something. Do you know what I mean? Like all of a sudden, like so for instance, we talked about this last week. A dude drove to Capitol Hill and threatened to level a couple of blocks with some tannerite, right? Well, all of a sudden, if that happens enough times, all of a sudden you live in a society where that's something that happens, and nobody even talks about that, which is what happened last week. In this case, so a couple things that go with this. One, if I had to guess, and of course I wasn't in the street when, these shots were being fired, I think some of that is for show. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm willing to be the guy in these right-wing paramilitary groups who's willing to take out his side piece and fire off a couple of rounds. I'm not wanting to kill somebody yet. But then meanwhile, you start seeing these excursions, these violent moments, right? They were beating people left and right. They were beating women. They corralled this one guy who was simply bringing water to like the Antifa, if we want to call them that, people. They made him crash his truck. They stabbed his tires so he wouldn't be able to get away. Then they opened up the door, beat on him, maced him, used all kinds of chemical agents, shot him with a bunch of paintballs, and then got in his truck and beat the living shit out of him. Meanwhile, by the way, the coverage today, which didn't go viral, nobody really talked about it, it just sort of existed. Like the headlines are like, Proud Boys use Proud Boys use paint guns, weapons, violence. And it's like, no, somebody took out his gun, right? And fired off a couple of rounds. All of a sudden, that starts becoming the status quo. You're exactly right. And the police, on one hand, I think you're right, is like they're tired of going out there and putting themselves on the line. But on the other hand, there is a direct connection between right-wing extremists and law enforcement. Mm-hmm. They're working towards the same end. And the end is they want the leftist or anybody who would go out and protest, they want them terrified. They want them thinking every time they get ready to step on the street that they might either get shot by the police, shot by an extremist, or left bloody and possibly maimed for the rest of their lives. Like those things are connected.
Yeah, I mean, they had a van that was for handicapped people. They overturned it. Like they flipped it over. They were breaking windows of cars that were driving by. The thing that I thought was interesting was that one of these videos that was going through was describing what apparently was somebody getting beat up and they were chasing after him. But all I could glean from it was two people were arguing loudly, and what descended upon them were 100 cameras in a round waiting for someone to throw a punch or have something violent that they can then post on social media. So that's what's becoming performative about this as well. It's like, what are we doing here? There are more people filming this thing than are actually participating in any kind of movement. And that's I guess that's the new age proto, whatever we're going to call this, era that we live in. Everything is televised. Everyone is on is a star in their own movie. And as a result, nobody stands for anything anymore.
Well, they're streaming it at the same time. That's the maddening part of all of this. Going back to last week, the guy who threatened to blow up Capitol Hill streamed all the ways through it, right? Mm-hmm. And they're trying. It's really hard thing to sort of wrap our heads around. And we talk about this sometimes when we sort of go into it and then we come out of it. It's the persona of it. It's the acting. It's the putting yourself in the mindset of I'm not me. I'm somebody that I want to be, right? I want to be like a badass, like, going out and laying people out and hurting people or whatever. And eventually what happens is over time, like media feeds into that. All of a sudden you're streaming, you're making money off of it. The Proud Boys in particular have become sort of the main focus of this stuff, which ensures that they'll do it again. Mm-hmm. They'll get more members. And on top of that, it probably means they're always going to escalate, right? They've already done one thing. They have to do the next thing. And it turns it into entertainment. It turns it into a commodity. It brings capitalism into it, which is one of the problems with the right now, which is that the right has to keep escalating. I mean, I don't like saying Marjorie Taylor Greene's name in general, but it was like the other day she was out there and she made a video. I don't know if you saw this, Nick, and she was like, Joe Biden, you're not the president. You are a piece of shit. And it's like, whoa, like that's new. You know what I mean? That's like this. And Joe Biden didn't see it. Like, I doubt Joe Biden's watched a video online in his entire life. It was for her supporters. And undoubtedly, she made money from that. It helped her persona. And and you always have to grow and grow and grow because capitalism makes it happen. And in this case, the attention, the focus, and play acting, that live action role playing, it has to keep growing and growing. And this existed before the internet. It just so happens that now it's immediate and it escalates even faster.
Well, and the growing part is also part of that, the culture of having all these toxic masculinity people involved and having to one up each other in who can get more violent is really what it feels like. That's what's so scary about that. And I don't know how often people listening are in those situations. I have a sense memory of like being in this every once in a while somewhere where you could tell like it's in the air, the electricity, like they are looking for violence and they are going to create it if they have to, and it's going to get even worse because they're going to amplify it together because they're more than 2 or 3 guys in a group together looking for this. So that's what's really frustrating about it, and it's almost like there's someone who wrote a book about exactly this and how this can actually metastasize. And that's the thing; it grows. And by the way, they use these videos to recruit, and there's no question that you get impressionable young teenage boys watching this stuff, and you can pick up a few more every month watching these things. We can't break that cycle, and then the only thing it does is grow, and that's where we're at, and it's been growing, right? I mean, the Proud Boys are relatively new, right? I think that at least the term Proud Boys is probably in the last 8 or 9 years, something like that, right? But obviously, the precursors of the Proud Boys we've had this for a century. Yeah,
no, we've had it for multiple centuries.
Yeah.
I mean, for as long as there have been frustrated young men, there's been paramilitary street gangs. I mean, like I found it the first time in my research. I found it in the 18th century in Britain during the French Revolution. All of a sudden you had, and by the way, I know this is shocking, but there were a lot of police members who were also part of a group that would go out and beat up what they called levelers, right? Or socialists or whatever. And you're exactly right about that. There's a contest in it, which is what I used to see when I snuck into Trump rallies. One person would yell a racial slur or a threat of violence, and then he would notice that nobody would tell him he couldn't do that. He wouldn't be removed. And then another dude next to him or a little ways away from him would ramp it up, right? And they just built and they built and they built. There are so many psychological parts of this, and a large part of it is overcompensation. The Proud Boys were started by, I don't even want to give the guy's name and give him any sort of credit, but it was started by one of the original Vice guys, the media company, Vice. Really? Yeah. And so it was started. And so if you ever watch this guy talk, or if you ever watch the leaders of the Proud Boys talk, so much of it is overcompensation. You know what I mean? It's how they dress, it's how they carry themselves, it's what they say. And this is what happens in a country when you have disaffected people, and particularly disaffected people who feel like they have a certain level of privilege that should be met. You know what I mean? So all of a sudden they don't have, as good of jobs or prospects, or they feel like they're living in a society where women and people of color suddenly have to be treated well, or LGBT community has to be respected. And so they take offense to that. And meanwhile, much like the Nazis said, come put this armband on, you've got friends. These people are like, no, come be a part of this, which is how street gangs work. You know what I mean? It's all about seeking power and support in numbers. And in this case, they feel like they have a political, not just ideology, but a political destiny. And at some point or another, live action role playing turns into just straight violence, just being a violent, dangerous person, which is what is happening with this group.
You know, when you talk about kids and trying to raise kids, the phrase that kept coming up with, like with my son, for instance, was oppositional defiance. And it's what describes, kids who get into a certain mode where no matter what you do, no matter what you suggest, they have to say no to it. It could, and when he would get in that role, we're like, let's go to the ice cream store. We'll get your favorite ice cream. No, never. I'm not going to do that. Like, it didn't matter what the suggestion was. He had to be no. And I kind of feel like
that's self-defeating.
Yeah, it was crazy. It's like, we're going to make you have fun. And he's like, no, we're not going to do it. And it was like, I feel like there's a through line because there's a lack of self-reflection as well. In the sense that, like, the realism of who they really are in this disaffected life of theirs, and they have to then drag everybody else down. But the Venn diagram is almost a circle between people like that and the people who, like, don't want to get the vaccine or wear a mask. Yep. Because it's the same sort. And by the way, this then extends into the female side of things as well, right? Because Proud Boys are male. I don't think we're seeing too many women involved in that side of things, right?
They have like certain. They have women who hang around the group, right? But that's not leadership or the main constituency.
Right. But meanwhile, the Karens out there that get into the anti-masking, those people, they're in control. They're powerful and they are instigators. They are leaders in this movement more so than you'd see on the Proud Boys side. But I feel like there's a similarity to the mindset that's developed out of that.
There is, and just to go ahead and make this personal because you brought the book up, it's like, I hadn't thought about this until right now, but like back when I was like 21 or so, I was like overcompensating. I was so insecure. I had no idea who I was. I created a persona. You know what I mean? Like you do. And that persona was somebody who would go out and get drunk and raise hell. And like I would go into a bar and I would want to fight people. Yeah. And it wasn't because I wanted to fight. It was because if I fought, I would show people that I was tougher than I felt. You know what I mean? And that idea, like, and I have to tell you that whenever I would get into those situations, like inside, I would be scared as hell, right? Like most people would be, until all of a sudden it becomes normal and you become sort of desensitized to it. And it's just something that you do. And I haven't thought about it until right now, but like me at that age, if the pandemic would have been raging, I don't know that I would have gotten the vaccine. I don't think I would have wore a mask. I'll tell you that damn much. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently. So much of this is about signaling to other people who you believe that you are, right? I'm not going to be one of those people. I'm not going to be weak and wear a mask or get a vaccine, right? We got words for people who do that, right? And a lot of it, I think, really has to do with Americans who they don't know who they actually are, right? They buy who they are, their trucks, what they wear or whatever. And by the way, like going back to what you were saying about like having a financial incentive to do all of this, like look at Kyle Rittenhouse. Like Kyle Rittenhouse killed 2 people, maimed others, and meanwhile, he's taking pictures with every right-wing luminary there is. Like, he's getting brought in, he's endorsing products, he's raising tons of money. A lot of this comes down to, and I'm sure it does with the Proud Boys and people like them, there's a financial incentive. There's a political incentive, a personal incentive, but also a financial incentive. Who are you presenting yourself as? How are you going to be perceived as a product? Because we're all now considered products, and I think that's a part of this as well.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm curious if we can explore for a minute the notion of what the media and what like Hollywood does to influence this behavior. Yep. Because, if you watch a movie like Born on the 4th of July, which was based on a book and a powerful, performance by Tom Cruise, he was raised to believe that he needed to be a soldier in the army. We see it in Forrest Gump too, the same idea, like in Lieutenant Dan, and so there was generation upon generation of people raised to believe that they needed to then sacrifice for their country and go fight. And I feel like in the movies too, if you're trying to find yourself and you're at late teen or early 20s and you're looking for what you described, you might be modeling it off of certain things you've seen in the media. And it reminds me, I was reading an interesting, and I shared it on my Twitter feed yesterday. A woman was talking about how she was at a pool on vacation, and there's these two guys ogling her at the pool, and she kind of ignored it. But that she ordered food at the pool, and she told the guy to put it on her room. And then one of the guys walks over to her a little bit later and asks for a light. She says, "Well, here, just keep the lighter. I have an extra one." Hours later, she's in her room, a door knock. And she goes, "Hello," and the guy says, "Yeah, room service." And she goes, "Well, I didn't order room service." He goes, "Oh, I'm just kidding. It was the guy from before with the lighter." She locked the door and went and hid in the hid in the corner, and hopefully he went away. Now, in the '80s, that might have been a meet cute scene, right? Where, whatever, he was being cute. He obviously heard her room number, overheard it, memorized it, remembered it hours later, and goes knocking on her door. But I got to tell you, I don't think there's a woman now, and probably even then, who would have thought anything other than this guy could very well come and kill me, and I'm now afraid for my life. But meanwhile, I'm sure the guy was probably influenced by some notion of like romanticism. Like, he thought this is going to be a dashing thing to do, and I think I don't know how that's going to be affected as we go forward, but I think there needs to be a re-education here.
Yeah, we talked about this. God, it must have been not the last weekend or the one before. And by the way, if you haven't signed up already, patreon.com/muckrake podcast. You get the Weekender, you get additional content. We talked about the movie Major League from the 1980s. And one of the main, is it Tom Berenger?
Yeah.
Is that the name? Like, he's the actor, right?
Yes.
And like the main subplot of that movie is that he is stalking his ex-girlfriend, like showing up at her house, following her, interrupting her at events. And like, she tells him to stop and he won't stop. And a lot of what we learn is through media. It 100% is. And we as a nation, Nick, we don't want to believe that we are susceptible to this stuff, right? Commercials don't get me, right? Like, I just watch movies and they don't do anything. No, it affects the way that you think. And like, we're dealing right now with a generation that was raised up on action movies, that was raised up on, we've talked about this in the past on our episodes. They were raised up in a Reagan culture or a 90s culture where it was basically like, the system doesn't work. The only way to make this better is a good guy with a gun, right? Mm-hmm. Overwhelming violence, which is, for those keeping track at home, fascism, right? Might makes right. You have to, like, some people have to be put aside or scared or killed or whatever. On top of that, I'm sorry, but there has to be an element of like, you're playing video games, you're out there solving problems through simulated warfare, right? Any number of these media things that isn't the whole of what's happening, right? Like, these situations do not occur until society starts to fray. And when society starts to fray, there is an ideology that comes through, because the ideology is what we keep talking about, which is the right says, liberal democracy doesn't work. We have to take over control of society, right? We need a dictator. We need a Caesar. We need a hierarchical power structure, because democracy is dangerous. It's been overthrown by conspiracies, Jews in the shadows, liberal traitors. So we have to take it over. These people, and by the way, like, we haven't even mentioned the fact that the forever wars have been going on, and eventually they come home in a culture of militarism. I mean, these people are dressed like, they're going to go into the desert and get into a firefight. Mm-hmm. Like, eventually what happens is you have a bunch of people who say, no, my life has meaning, and the meaning of my life is I'm going to fix this problem if I have to kill people. And that's how these things take off, is people are searching for meaning in uncertain times, and then they make a decision, which is, I'm willing to die for this, or I'm willing to kill for this. Right now, we've seen them kill. We've seen them hurt people. We've seen them violate one law after another. The question is whether or not that live action role playing that we're talking about, that persona, whether or not that stops and it turns into, no, now we are just taking care of this situation. How many battles have these people been in at this point? You know what I mean? You become battle hardened. Yeah. All of a sudden you start believing what you say. And they fetishize so many fascistic things, like far right regimes that would like just absolutely slaughter leftists and communists and socialists. They would take them up on helicopters and throw them out in the water. They wear shirts that lionize this stuff. Like you can't swim in that for so long without it taking over.
I mean, especially because the notion of a free and open society is that you're allowed to be a socialist if you want to, right? And you're allowed to have whatever, whatever identity you want to have. And so when you look at like on one side, like progressives, obviously we're trying to, fight for more rights for those people. And the other side will argue for the notion of like freedom, but again, not for anybody and not for everybody. I would be remiss, by the way, just to describe that the iconic romantic comedy image we have in our society right now would probably be, in Say Anything, which is a stalking case with, John Cusack holding the boombox over his head and keeping her awake all night with a song, trying to like get her back after a failed, relationship, which probably was doomed anyway. So I feel like all these images, they're flooding in, and clearly, Hollywood is trying to hold a mirror up to society. They're trying to create, entertainment. They probably don't necessarily realize what the underlying effect could be when you talk about all the different, movies about violence and all those things that could have an effect. They don't necessarily realize how influential that is. But by the way, I'm a little bit worried that we're sounding like that group of mothers in the 80s who wanted to put the ban on rap, and testified in front of Congress. Are we sounding like that now?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm not sitting here saying that I think things should be outlawed, but I do think that I think there's a split, like there is in most things, right? I think there are people in media who are like, no, we're in the entertainment business and this is what we do, right? But there are other people, and this is, by the way, to go ahead and make this political, it's like the Republican Party in a lot of senses. There are people in the Republican Party who are like, it's politics, baby. We're just playing a game, right? Like, we're not trying to get people hurt. Like, let's get some dinner afterwards, even though I said that you were part of a cabal, right? And then we'll figure it out. But then there's other people, man. And those other people are true blue believers. Like, I'm sorry, but some people, when they make a movie, when they write a book, they're trying to change society. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, they're trying to disseminate an idea or a concept or a worldview. There are people on the right who legitimately believe that liberal democracy doesn't work and that representative government doesn't work and that white supremacy is the only saving grace, probably a theocratic, religious-based white supremacist society, and that if voting is going to get out of hand, we have to disenfranchise people. If leftists are going to be in the street, some of them are going to have to die, right? I mean, there are true blue people who believe that, and it's this weird dance between the people who hear it and the people who feel it. You know what I mean? And it comes in and then it animates them.
And we talk about this all the time. The connection I was going to make was, I think a lot of times these Republican leaders don't necessarily recognize just how influential they really are. So when they are just playing politics, they are inciting people to murder other people, but they wouldn't ever really feel that or believe it. Now, there are the other Republican leaders who I think know what they are doing. And that's when you get into the kind of thing like Ron DeSantis in Florida. Right now, that's an interesting question we can kind of dissect here. Perhaps is whether he's one of those guys who went to Harvard. He's supposedly very, very smart, and we have to figure out whether or not because obviously he's trying to become the front runner for the presidential nomination if Trump doesn't run, or even if Trump does run, who knows? But with what he is doing right now with COVID denying. Among other things, it's hard to tell exactly what his triangulation is, other than obviously the winning a political war. But he might actually understand the detriment, the real horrible thing that he's doing to his state.
Yeah, and we talked about this in the past with Tucker Carlson, who might actually be DeSantis's rival. For the Republican nomination in 2024. Man, that's a gross thought, isn't it?
The DeSantis Carlson ticket.
Oh, them being on a stage trying to outright each other. Whoa, that's bleak. But we talked about this with Tucker, and it's like Tucker has always had classist white supremacist leanings. He's hid it for the purposes of being on TV and being on MSNBC and CNN and being in the right magazines and being in the right circles. Well, you want to talk about somebody who decides that's not going to be a persona anymore, they're going full bore. Tucker ends up in Hungary talking to Viktor Orban, and is advocating for the overthrow of liberal democracy, right? Ron DeSantis, to me, feels like a guy who is still figuring out what he believes and how far he's willing to go. But the frightening thing here is that all of his posturing with COVID, all of this stuff, I mean, he is shoveling his constituents into the maw of a generational pandemic. All of that posturing, which is absolutely for, the purposes of gaining a new base among Trumpists, also making money. We can't forget about that part of it. But the other part is he is the chosen avatar, the chosen leader of the far right people that we talk about, who talk about needing a Caesar. He's the guy that the people who talk about overthrowing liberal democracy and installing a strongman authoritarian, he's on their dartboard, or on their cork board. This is the guy that they think. So that's the question, right? Is how much of the posturing can turn into authoritarianism? At what point does that dog whistling and doing all this for money and political power and being recognized lead to the point where you're like, yeah, what do you need from me? Let's do it. Absolutely. Yeah. Let's go full bore.
Well, interestingly enough, when we had a sense of decorum around politics, right? We had it, right? People knew that you really shouldn't say certain things for a while, right?
There were at least for a while an out of bounds line.
Yeah,
is what I would say.
And so the interesting question was why? Because did the people who insisted on having decorum realize that this was going to be the result? By the way, Jared, this is nothing. 10 years from now, if nothing changes, I shudder to think what politics is going to be like if we still have a place to, call America, because I'm sensing there's a lot of depth here that we could go down and deeper into in the muck and really make it horrible and ugly. You know what I mean? There are lines.
The moment that we have an empire redeeming movement, if that happens, that's different. You know what I mean? When all of a sudden you have a white supremacist, hierarchical, anti-democratic movement that is all about reinstalling American empire and overcome. I'm sure we've already seen parts of it where they're saying that Biden pulled out of Afghanistan because the Chinese wanted him to, because Jewish people wanted him to, the deep state wanted him to. Undoubtedly, that's going to metastasize into something. And if the Republicans choose that and they mix together all those different parts, you and I aren't even having a podcast anymore. You know what I mean? At that point, that doesn't happen.
Right. I mean, people start getting jailed for beliefs. That's what I'm starting to picture. I mean, God, I hate it when we do that and we get into the real, darkness of what could be. But that's what I mean. I guess in the event that you're talking about would be, somebody wins a major presidential election, has control over both houses. It. Yeah, or steals it, and it's we're on the precipice still, and I don't know if we're ever going to feel like we're not. And by the way, you mix in there Afghanistan, where people like Al Qaeda can continue to train. I'm wondering if that's going to take over as well. Are we all going to be on edge now, worried about potential attack because we now know that they're reconstituting and potentially doing that? You know what I'm saying?
I don't think we're living in fear anymore. I mean, I think there's fake fear.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, to keep us under control.
The conspiracy theory stuff, I think, is what people are afraid of, quote unquote afraid of. We're living in a pandemic where people are bring on death. I mean, death is around every single corner. What I think we need to look out for, and this goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, it's when it's not just Portland. When all of a sudden you have and we've already seen that during BLM. I mean, we saw, far right groups that would get in the street and go after people. And of course, we saw it on January 6th. When you start seeing paramilitary street gangs that are going around intimidating people, and it becomes part of your life. And not to make this dramatic, but that's what happened in Germany. Like, or Italy. You look up one day, and actually now let's go ahead and draw the line back. That's what happened here in the South post-Civil War. You minded your P's and your Q's because the KKK, the red shirts, the Redeemers, they were walking down the street, and if you were a person of color or a Republican who was trying to work with them, you could get murdered. Like that. Or if you did the wrong thing, or they would overthrow your government. When you start having the constant threat of violence, going back to what you said, that's not open society.
Right.
That's not where open society exists. You have a veneer of it, right? But there's a guy with a swastika who has a gun, and he has complete permission from the state, or at least part of the state, to kill you or to intimidate you. And when that starts happening, and I have to tell you really, really quickly from the research that I'm doing, I'm just going to lay this out there because we're running late in the episode. I just want to put this on the table for the future. If there isn't some sort of violent interruption of an election in the next 3 years, I would be shocked. Because what I keep seeing throughout history is these things crescendo and grow and grow and grow. And eventually these groups, they set up around polling sites to, quote unquote, protect the vote.
Yeah.
And that, to me, now feels like if we miss that bullet, I would be shocked.
Right. Now, I mean, listen, it's easy for you to make that prediction. And maybe somewhere across this large country of ours it's going to happen. You can say, I was right. Like it is, you can say that and probably be right on that one without it having to be a thing that's taking over the whole country or it's dissolving into chaos. But again, it's those norms that we were talking about and the decorum that we would demand across the board with our politicians. Whether or not we sense a direct line between maintaining that decorum and fascism, clearly what we're seeing now is it is a direct line, and it might take a while. But you could get there, and we're all living longer and longer lives, right? So suddenly, if we're into our 80s or 90s, we might end up seeing it. We might see it before that. Either way, it's awful. And, I wonder if that even affects the other side as well, where they're like, well, so what? We're on our way that anyway, then let's just make it happen now and screw it.
No, they think that.
Yeah.
No, they think that.
Let's just get there.
I have turned up my patrolling of right-wing spaces, right-wing media, right-wing spaces, these sort of groups and all that. And I have to tell you that they're like, this thing's inevitable. What are we waiting on? Do you know what I mean? Like
right.
they think that this thing is baked in, and we're running too hot. That's the whole point, is that society right now, that's what we're talking about with Portland. American society is running too hot right now. Unfortunately. All right. So we're going to welcome on Joseph L. Flatley, again, the host of the Failed State Update and the author of New Age Grifter. An interesting conversation about what happens when people need meaning in a world like this and how it oftentimes leads to them getting hurt or going to extremes. All right, everybody. We have a real treat here today. We're with Joseph L. Flatley, the host of the Failed State Update and author of the new book, New Age Grifter, the true story of Gabriel of Urantia and his cosmic family. Joseph, this is an interesting conversation. We've talked about modern politics quite a bit. Mm-hmm. You've gone and written an incredibly interesting, I think, prescient little book here. Can you go ahead and start by telling our audience, who is the cosmic family? Who is Gabriel? Can you try to even unravel what this thing is in some sort of a semblance of sense?
I can try. Gabriel of Urantia is a religious leader who has a religious community in southern Arizona, and his group is called the Global Community Communications Alliance, which sounds like a cell phone provider or something, but it's actually the vanguard of human spirituality. And what these people are doing is they're waiting for the second coming, for Jesus to return, for UFOs to come and rescue them from the tumultuous rapture that's consistently been on the brink of happening for the last 30 years. And then after all that happens, these guys and girls are going to basically become the new world leadership, the new world government. They have a term. What is that term? It's divine government or something. But that's what they'll tell you. What I've learned is this Gabriel of Urantia fellow is actually Tony Delavan from Pittsburgh. And, he failed as a musician. He had a couple wives divorce him. He was just kind of like a spiritual seeker and also a bit of a con man, I believe. And he assembled what, would commonly be referred to as a destructive cult, or what I would go so far as to call, perhaps a criminal organization. It's just an opinion, but I think I made a pretty good case of it in this book. And, basically, after being contacted by ex-members of this group 4, 5, maybe 6 years ago now, I've kind of endeavored to tell the story of the group, the ex-members. It's very much their story as well, and kind of where this kind of unique religious organization, where it fits into like what I call the culture of American decline right now, which is like the world's going to hell, and what are groups like the GCCA and figures like Gabriel of Urantia, what role do they play in all that?
Yeah, and that's what I'm really interested in. I think that you did a really good job in this book, sort of bringing together the different threads of this, going into the history of it. I mean, when you really look at it, this is a quintessential American story. You brought up the fact that Gabriel, or Tony, however we want to refer to him, is a musician. I suppose it would be fair enough to call this a new age musician, sort of an opening of the mind, sort of a person who trafficked in a lot of the 1960s, 1970s. Sort of human potential. It's hard to talk about this. We all know what it is, right? That new age sort of culture, and that's where this thing birthed itself from. Can you talk a little bit about what that genesis is and how you go from that? And obviously, we know about things like, other musicians who have brought around themselves cults of personality, to turn a phrase. Can you talk a little bit about what it is about that time period or that mindset that sort of allows this thing to coalesce together?
Yeah, so Gabriel started out here in Pittsburgh as a Catholic, and I don't know if you've heard of the charismatic Catholic movement, but that was largely birthed in Pittsburgh at Duquesne University. And that was a movement of within Catholicism to try to bring in more elements from evangelical Christianity. And so Gabriel, as a musician, he was a musician, but he also had the spiritual side. But it was really, a matter of trying to going from religious movement to religious movement, trying to find a place to fit in, but also a place where he can kind of stake his claim to the world. So he got on board with born again Christianity. He started a religious community in Tucson, Arizona that, I spoke to his ex-partner in that endeavor, and he said, looking back, it really looked like Cult 1.0. So bringing in people off the street, kind of not only preaching to them or helping them out, but kind of dictating their lives. Like, I'm your spiritual elder and I can tell you, who you should marry or the best, that was a movement within Christianity in the 70s. And he was a part of that. And then 70s becomes the 80s and he starts adopting new age beliefs like channeling, and then he fell into the Urantia book community, where that's like a homegrown American UFO spiritual text.
Can you tell the audience about this, because the Urantia book is fascinating?
Yeah, Urantia book was was printed in 1950, perhaps that late, in Chicago, and it was the product of a group of people who got together, and they claimed, the person who started this group, William Sadler, claimed that he had befriended a guy who would go to sleep and have these kind of transmissions or communications with God. And so basically, William Sadler could go to him with questions, and then the guy in his sleep would answer, or would channel a higher power that would answer, and return the answers to his study group. Now, William Sadler would go off and come back a week later with answers to these people's questions. You tell me, was it a sleeping man or was it William Sadler sitting down at his desk? But either way, this group started asking questions of this man. They started going through and like reading and revising and editing, and through this kind of like back and forth process over the course of like 20 some years, came up with this document called the Urantia book. It's about 2,000 pages. It's supposed to have no author, and it's really just a history of the universe and what's going on in outer space and who all these angels are. And then it kind of works up to Jesus Christ and his life. And in that way, it's a retelling of his life, very similar to like the Book of Mormon. And, these space religions, I would consider Mormonism one, even though like they didn't have that science fiction terminology, but similar kind of thing. Nation of Islam, Scientology, Urantia is very much in that mold. And Gabriel took it and kind of adapted it, stole some of the concepts basically and adapted it to his own high control group out there in the desert.
Yeah, and it's so strange. I mean, I've been doing all this research on history, and there's always like this weird relationship between what is happening in the world, particularly people who have lost faith in the world and politics and processes. Like I was just spending some time a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you've come across spiritualism.
Yeah.
Which is, it's this period of time, for people who don't know it. It's really, really popular in the United States, particularly post-Civil War, where people wanted to feel like basically the onslaught of human suffering that just occurred. Their husbands, brothers, sons, uncles who had just died in the Civil War could talk to them and could lead them, right? They could get out of some sort of moment of crisis or something like that. And it feels like people in moments of secular crisis, particularly, keep reaching for some sort of spiritual sort of saving or some sort of spiritual raft. And I think your idea of American decline intertwined with that, I think speaks to that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still teasing this out. There's definitely a narrative that you could craft saying world's going to shit, America's collapsing, we no longer have faith in our institutions, so people are abandoning traditional churches and, I don't know, going to tarot card readers or going to cults or, inventing their own religions or whatever. I mean, it seems really true to me. I don't know, like, if you were to, like, strictly say, are there more cults now than there were 50 years ago? Or, is that true? Or do we just have a greater interest in it? Because, Netflix definitely has a greater interest in, that kind of programming. Maybe we're just fascinated in it for those things I just named. But it's like, I'm definitely interested in that phenomenon because I think it's all of one piece for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating because this is a UFO religion.
Yeah.
Right. And like now we're having like this weird revival of like UFOism and looking to the stars and expecting to make contact at any given moment. Can you talk a little bit about what the process of that faith is and how that all sort of intertwines in this story?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it being a cult, I really do feel that the psychological element of now, of course, these UFO religions and cults are all outrageous, and they're outrageous to the point where most of us look at it and go, we would never join that. What kind of sucker would join that? That's not for me at the very least. But that's kind of the point of the outrageousness, because they're looking for people who are in a particular state. Maybe they're like interested in those messages, those terms, new age general philosophy, but they're also at a point in their life where they're not willing to reject that stuff out of hand, like an emotional point. So really, like, there's a reason that Gabriel only has 120 followers, but those are his followers. They're there for a reason. And I just think when you start looking at it, at a cult, not as a belief system, but as a system of control, the actual beliefs sort of become window dressing. And, and that's why I didn't spend a ton of time. I went into the beliefs of the group and I tried to portray them, but, I was much more interested in like the psychological aspects of control. I think that, because who am I to say that Gabriel isn't talking to angels, if you really want to go there. But I do have a problem with people not getting health care, which, or people not getting fed. So.
Yeah, and I that's the thing about it is it's like I have these conversations with people who are particularly sort of entranced by things like QAnon and sort of it being the umbrella of a lot of different sort of conspiracy theories, but also New Age faith.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's not just the idea that there are like secret organizations that are hurting children or subverting the government, but that there's like there's part of it that believes there's a fleet of UFOs that is just on the other side of the moon and it's being kept from us, or everything from ancient aliens to sort of interdimensional rifts or hollow earth or any of these other things. And those are just always stories that sort of are at the surface, right? Like you talk to somebody about that when they're talking about hollow earth or they're talking about hidden armadas, they're not talking about hollow earth or hidden armadas. They're talking about a lack of faith in society and institutions and the fabric of things. And when you start looking for that, and when you do not have faith in those institutions or other people, you look for it where you can find it, and that can make you vulnerable.
Yes, and I think, QAnon is such an apt comparison because we're seeing now play out nationally what may perhaps 30 years ago when Gabriel got started was only playing out in these smaller groups. As much as like QAnon is a cult and sucks people in and is dangerous, has dangerous actors spreading misinformation, I really think that people are primed for that stuff by poverty and by not having health care and by not being treated right by government, not having jobs. So it's like, the same way that Gabriel's out looking for people that are specifically vulnerable to his message, bigger political actors are doing the same thing. Perhaps have always been doing the same thing, but we do seem to be at a crisis point now with it in this country.
Yeah, so so after you've spent all of these years and all this time and all this energy looking at this group and starting to understand their workings, their beliefs, the systems of control, what have you walked away with? I mean, this is a very interesting, fascinating, focused study that you have done.
Yeah.
You've talked with these people, you've researched them, you've spent years immersed in this thing. And what are you walking away with? What do you find yourself thinking about this and feeling about this now that this book is out and now that you're dealing with the aftermath of it?
I mean, sometimes my work, veers into these like big picture questions, but I really just, it's the people that I'm writing about that really, when you read the story, it's very much like assembled through many ex-members' stories. So it's, I just can't get away from the fact that there are really people involved in this shit. They are really hurt by what happened to them. they are victimized, and that it's going to continue to happen, and that I mean, that's the bottom line. These are real stories about real people, and speaking to real people, not in the book, but reading the book. Like, if you think this can't happen to you, or you think that you're like too smart for it, or that this has no relevance in your life, I'm here to tell you these are people just like you. And just because you have a different religion or different political bent doesn't mean that like somebody can't or perhaps isn't doing this to you right now on some level.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that idea that Netflix has like a weird sort of focus on this, because there are so many programs, series, all of it that sort of take this weird voyeuristic part of these organizations, and they're almost, I feel like they're almost produced specifically to give us a moment of, oh my God, I would never be a part of that, or I
Yeah.
can't believe who these people are. And in a way, I feel like that kind of downplays the common humanity of it. Like, I'm sitting here talking to you, and like we're talking about this intellectually, and like there's stuff that undoubtedly that you and I have beliefs in that other people would think are bizarre and strange and out there. And like I almost feel like in this current moment, we're so sort of ostracized or alienated from each other that we sort of lose that common humanity of the stories and the experience that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's that whole. It's just the battle lines are drawn at this point. I have friends who won't get the vaccine. And like we can communicate because I won't go around them because of the Delta variant. But, we can talk on the phone because that's really like 1/10 of what we have going on, and it's like, there's something to be said for humanizing the person you think is the other, because they're not the other. They're just a person like you are, I feel so strongly about this, yet I have no real way to like articulate it. And that's kind of one of the things I'm thinking about all the time, because it's like, where is that line between disagreement and ideological enemy? Like, I feel like, it's like, on one hand, I hate to sound like some middle of the road mainstream pundit who's like, there's too much division in this country. It's like, yes, because some things you cannot accept. You can't accept racism. You can't accept, hate crimes, whatever. But how do we navigate the humanity of even our enemies? I don't know. It's been on my mind a lot, and you brought it up.
I think about it a lot. I quit Facebook like awesome. 10 months ago. By the way, I recommend it to everybody. Like, if you can, please, you'll feel better. But I quit it because, man, I was just watching my family left and right descend down the QAnon white supremacist conspiracy theory rabbit hole. And what I had found, though, before I had to like pull the eject cord, was that when I would talk to those people, like while it was happening, it was always coinciding with personal crisis, right? Like they were always like one bill away from losing their house, or losing their house, or losing their health insurance, or their kids were having problems. And what it came down to was these things, these conspiracy theories, these cults of white supremacy. They offered an arranging idea, right? Something that sort of like lashed reality together and gave it a quote unquote meaning or a reason. And it again, it felt like sort of a raft for them.
Yeah. And that goes to like, we talk about vaccines, like getting vaccines to other countries that don't have them is only going to save our ass. Like, it doesn't even have to be a selfless act. Right. I think that getting healthcare and employment for people that you don't agree with, or maybe you don't even like very well, is also, it doesn't have to be a selfless act. It's self-preservation. because, you need to, this country is spinning out, we've talked about this on my podcast, Failed State Update, it's like, sometimes you just reach to the point where it's like, America's nuts. It's losing its shit. That's what the problem is, and like, we gotta find ways to stop people from collectively going insane. And, I don't think people would be listening to QAnon if they had jobs, or they had health care. I mean, did you see the video, the guy that allegedly had the bomb? I don't know if he did or not, like in DC the other day, where he was in his car and he was on Facebook. So I guess you wouldn't have seen it. But, he's on Facebook and he's like, complaining about health care, and, his wife has cancer and the doctors, can't cover it, and he needed some treatment. And he went to the doctor because it was supposed to be covered by his health insurance, but by the time he got there, it was no longer covered by his health insurance. And so he's like, well, I'm going to sit out here with a bomb until we solve this problem. And it's like, he was literally driven nutsy by this horrible system we have. And like, the point you've made so many times that I just think can't be made enough is this state that the country is in right now is the result of decisions that are purposefully made by people who are making money off those decisions.
Yeah, and we've reached the final sort of stage. Well, I mean, hopefully it's the final stage of that. But I mean, it has gotten to the point where everyone is under pressure. Everybody is feeling the crunch. Everybody is feeling the squeeze. And, if everyone's feeling the squeeze and all of a sudden it feels like the ship is going down, and, like we've been talking about this a lot on the show. It's like leaving Afghanistan. Like, I'm all for it. We needed to get out of there, but it's also a powerful symbol. You know what I mean? Like, that the American empire is in decline, which those of us who are actually paying attention know it and have known it for a while, that this thing was happening. But it sort of leads to, we talked about it last week, and I said it was sort of like it's the canary in the coal mine. When you start witnessing how people who aren't doing great start reacting to it, and it's sort of like it's worse and worse and worse, it's really hard to be away from that, or to feel like like it's not going to reach you at some point. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, it's just really, at this point, it's like America is a psychological pressure cooker. I think if you look at, the collapse of the Soviet Union, very similar. It's new age cults, bizarre thinking, these like weird Soviet era, like early Soviet era thinkers that like surmised that solar sunspots were responsible for humans like committing murder, and that you could like look at the sun and directly predict how people would react. And this like pseudoscientific stuff all had a great resurgence once, Soviet Union collapsed. And now you go on YouTube, still, I don't understand the language, but some of the best crackpot videos of like weirdo angels and stuff comes from, the former Soviet bloc.
Well, Eurasianism is all based on the idea of Atlantis and Hyperborea.
Right.
I mean, it literally is a resurgence of some of the like furthest New Age conspiracy theory mythologies. And I mean, like, if you look at like Alexander Dugin and sort of the neo-fascistic cult that he's in charge of, and Steve Bannon is part of that. Like, they're pushing Blavatsky. They're pushing like sacred Tibetan elders. You know what I mean? Like, that's the type of stuff that is actually like gaining passage now.
And when I visited the cult in Arizona and was in the compound for about 5 hours one Sunday, they were pushing Blavatsky. It all comes around to cults, I guess.
Yeah, for anybody who isn't aware, just to get people up to date, this is Helena Blavatsky, who ended up being called Madame Blavatsky, who said, of course, that she had come across Tibetan elders who could teleport. They had telepathy, and that they gave hidden secrets of the universe, if that sounds familiar. And that all ended up getting wrapped up into a little thing that we all like to call the National Socialist Party of Germany.
Yeah. I mean, when people abandon what little rational thought they do have, stuff goes bad really quickly. And I think that's kind of the lesson in all of this.
So this book being out, your research being done, I just wonder, how does it make you feel about America in general? Like what's your ultimate takeaway, would you say? I mean, there's the individual part of it. There is the lack of hope and sort of the collapsing of the state. Do you expect more of this? Do you think people are going to find their own way? Like, how do you see this shaken out?
Yeah, people, what really came home to me, like in kind of like a strict legalistic sense, in hearing these people's stories, like, is the government does not have a framework for dealing with groups like this. They don't care. If you go into a child custody case with, your partner is still on the inside and they want control of your kid, and they're telling their kid, that the UFOs are coming and that you have been taken over by fallen beings, and, you have to pay child support because your partner doesn't have any income except they're working for this like multi-million-dollar organization that's able to shell out for great lawyers to nail you. Legal system doesn't care. The U.S. government doesn't care about this stuff. And it's only going to get worse just because, and there's partially a good reason for that, or there's a justification for that. And it's like, in America, we don't tell you what you have to believe. We don't tell you that you're crazy because, the government doesn't tell you that you're not really a religion because you believe in UFOs, not Jesus. But that said, it's like there's absolutely no framework for protecting people. There's existing laws, people, it's up to like state governments, local governments, county governments to deal with the crimes that happen in places like this, and they don't know or care. Nobody wants to talk about cults because when you start talking about cults, you're the crazy one. It's like not the cult leader. It's the guy that tells you that there's a cult out there, because you're talking about cults. So it's kind of like, it's really been up to victims and to try to deal with this problem. And it's like, in a post-Trumpian world where the government's trying to shed as much responsibility as possible, I don't see it getting any better. And that's really the whole point of this book. I'm not even like I'm not telling people what to believe. I'm just saying, like, literally, I just want people to go, my mom's thinking, and I've got an email from this woman who said this exact same thing the other day. My mom's, being attracted by this cult. They're trying to get my mom to join. So I Googled it, and your book was the first thing that came up. So, now, thank you for giving me this resource with which I can try to help my mother. I mean, it's kind of lame, but that's really the best we can do, I think.
All right. And we've been talking with Joseph L. Flatley, the author of New Age Grifter and the host of the Failed State Update. Joseph, where can the good people find you?
On Twitter, @Lenny Flatley. If you want to talk to me or hear my podcasts or check out my books, lennyflatley.net. And please sign up for my newsletter. It's called Failed State Update, and it's lennyflatley.substack.com. And please get in touch.
Thank you so much, Joseph. All right, everybody. That was Joseph L. Flatley. An interesting conversation again about these destructive communities where people need meaning, particularly in a society that's disintegrating. And sometimes, I don't know, you mass on the southern border and you wait on UFOs to come and ferry you away at the apocalypse.
Well, for what it's worth, I think we're going to make contact with some aliens within the next 25 years anyway. So, that's my feeling on that one.
You said that the other day. You texted that to me when I told you I was going to talk to Joseph. So you're putting the marker down, 25 years making contact.
Yeah. And by the way, it doesn't feel great because the bottom line is they're going to be so far advanced than us that we just have to hope that they're like Star Trek and stuff is like peaceful, because otherwise it's right. It's going to be like the War of the Worlds, which I did finish, by the way. The English
there you
version.
go. Well, I just want to say on that topic, I still enjoy that we are at a place of crisis, not just politically and socially, but also environmentally, and that we're at such a place of crisis that all of a sudden people are now talking about the possibility of aliens being here, and there's more and more sort of state sanction of that, and we're just like, all right, everybody, you hang out, ET. We got stuff we need to take care of, which is like one of the more baffling parts of the last few years.
Or unless it's one of those moments, the galvanizing moment where we all have to come together as humans on Earth to fight against these aliens or whatever, and it saves us, But I'm not putting a lot of stock in that one either. But I mean, I love my favorite part of all the War of the Worlds, all of them, is just the irony that they come here to kill us all and then they die because we're so toxic. Basically.
I do enjoy, really quickly, I enjoy that a few years ago there was that story of like the potential alien probe that passed through our solar system, and they knew that it was probably not organic because it saw us and it took off. It was like, I gotta get the hell out of this solar system.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll talk more about that when we come back on Friday with the regularly scheduled Weekender edition. Again, if you want access to that, and you should. You absolutely should. It's worth it. And on top of that, it supports the show. It keeps us ad-free and keeps us free of editorial oversight, so we can actually talk about real shit on here. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/muckrakepodcast. You'll gain access to the Weekender, our Discord channel. On top of that, live episodes, behind-the-scenes ideas, all kinds of stuff. That's patreon.com/muckrakepodcast. If you need us before the episode on Friday, you can find Nick at Can You Hear Me SMH. You can find me at JY Sexton. My God, everybody stay safe.